Hi everyone. I thought I'd make a video to give you feedback on the in-class assignment that we did during week 6. If it's been a few days, just as a reminder that the week 6 ICA we did on Wednesday, and it was the one where you make a list of evidence that you would use in answering a hypothetical essay prompt. And I thought that would be a good preparation exercise to do for the in-class essay, which is coming up during week 7. So the essay prompt, the hypothetical essay prompt was something like, how does this author think about propaganda? Is it good for democracy or harmful to it, and why? And then the instructions were to first make a list, and then from that list, write your thesis. And the reason why I wanted you to do it in that order is because if you do it in that order, you're much more likely to come up with a very strong thesis that has specific answer to the question. And also it will save you time. It's much more time consuming to have a thesis answer in your head and then go looking for evidence to support your answer. I don't want you to do that. In academia, we always do the reverse. We look at the evidence first, and then we form our answer based on the evidence that we have, okay? So the most common area of improvement that I saw was that, everybody did the first step very well. You can find evidence in the text, of course. You can do that even if you haven't read the article, right? That's the easy part. The hard part requires you to have read the article and be very familiar with it, right? And so that is narrowing down that list of evidence to which are the most central parts of evidence that are key to that author's argument. That's the hard part. That's why you have to be really familiar with the argument that the author is making, okay? So how do you identify which are the most central pieces of evidence? Well, one thing I want to remind you of is, remember how during the first week of class, I gave you that handout on how to analyze an argument, where the first step is to identify the different parts of the argument, the author's research question, what the problem is they're trying to solve, what their answer is, but then most importantly, what are their main propositions of the argument? So how do they get to that answer? And then finally, there's also identifying the assumptions. So that's where you need to use those skills in order to do this exercise. Because if you can identify the author's main propositions, then you can identify which ones on your list of evidences are the most central, because they're the ones that are relating to those main propositions, okay? So again, it's helpful to go back and make sure that you've watched the videos for some of these authors, because that usually in the videos I'm giving you what their main propositions are, or what the main takeaways are, right? So for example, let's say we've got Lippmann. One of Lippmann's key propositions is that he thinks propaganda is inevitable, right? That's something that many people identified, is that a certain author thinks propaganda is inevitable. But the key part of that is to say, why do they think it's inevitable? Then that's actually their key proposition. So for Lippmann, he thinks propaganda is inevitable because we are all like Miss Sherwin. That was his example. That's how you can tell a proposition often, is that they'll give you lots of examples. So if you remember the example of Lippmann, of Miss Sherwin that Lippmann gave, she was an example of how we cannot all witness the key events of history ourselves firsthand. Most of us, we were not in New York on 9/11. We were not in Belgium, and we didn't witness Germany invading Belgium at the beginning of the First World War. We weren't in Germany during Hitler's reign. We weren't there for the vast, vast majority of the important events of history that happened, right? We didn't see them ourselves firsthand. So we are all Miss Sherwin. We're all like her. We all have to rely on the pictures in our heads in order to have an understanding of these sorts of key historical events, these sorts of facts, right? So that's why Lippmann thinks it's inevitable. And then that becomes one of his main propositions. Because if that proposition is not true, if we can actually verify facts of history for ourselves, if we do have that ability, then Lippmann's whole argument collapses, right? So just remember that, like, propositions are the ones where without them, or if they prove to be false, the author's whole argument collapses. And also sometimes, I've had students ask me, how can you distinguish an assumption from a proposition. And that can be kind of tricky too, but here's how you can distinguish it. Let's take the example of Stanley. The idea that the U.S. has a lot of inequality or is an unjust place. Is that an assumption of Stanley's argument, or is it a key proposition? Well, one way to distinguish between the two is that an author will spend almost no time at all talking about an assumption, but they will spend a lot of time talking about their key proposition, and they will often give examples. Stanley gives lots and lots of examples about various injustices and inequalities that have happened in the U.S., and so that becomes a key proposition of his argument. If that proposition is false, if the U.S. does not have a lot of inequality or injustice, then Stanley's whole argument falls apart. Okay? So the difference is assumptions are taken for granted, and the author won't spend any time explaining or justifying them, but they will spend a lot of time explaining or justifying one of their main propositions. Finally, remember that the conclusion itself is also a main proposition. So you almost certainly want to have something about their conclusion, not necessarily their recommendations. Remember, Lippmann made recommendations. That's not necessarily his conclusion, though. Conclusion, especially if the essay prompt is something like, how does the author think about propaganda? Then their conclusion is like, what is the definition of propaganda for this author? So that's got to be in there too. You want to be sure that you don't have something like, you don't just leave it at, well, the author thinks it's bad, or it's inevitable, or it's pervasive. Those are all good points, but why do they think it's bad? Why do they think it's inevitable? Why do they think it's pervasive? And you want to make sure you actually have their actual definition listed as one of their key points, because of course that is a key point. So for example, Lippmann defines propaganda as the attempt to alter or manipulate the pictures in our heads. For Stanley, his definition of propaganda is that it is false ideology. So you would want to have something like that. If this was the hypothetical essay prompt, you would want to have that in your answer. If you make the list of evidence first, and then you can take a step back and remember, what are the key points here? What are the propositions? Try to identify the propositions of the argument. Then you'll be able to narrow that list down to the most central ones. And then don't forget also that those need to be then reflected in your thesis statement. So that was another area where sometimes it fell apart, is that sometimes students had the list there, but that list didn't make it over into the thesis statement itself. So make sure that you've got in your thesis statement, you've got those main points. And that's how you come up with a really strong thesis statement, which should ideally be just like one sentence, maybe two sentences. If you're getting to 3 sentences, you need to make your thesis statement, you're really pushing it, try to condense it back down. Just be able to say, like I said in class, this author thinks propaganda is this for this, this, and this reason. 1, 2, 3. That's what I mean about a nice, short, succinct answer to the essay prompt. That's what your thesis statement is. Remember, you're going to go back and elaborate on each of those points in the body paragraphs, but your answer is nice, short, and succinct answer to the question in the first paragraph of the in-class essay. Okay? So I hope this was helpful. Most of y'all did really, really well on this. There's just a little bit of room for improvement for the vast majority of you. And that's where it comes, is identifying which are the key pieces of evidence, and then making sure that those key pieces of evidence get reflected also in the thesis statement itself. All right? So I'll see y'all in class on Monday.